the polarizing figure we were talking about. We touched on it earlier in the show, but that's Jamal Adams. And we saw it firsthand on the text, Dave. People going, he's a bust. He is. He's always been a bust, and he's no good. Get rid of him, whatever. Pete Carroll talked about, and I would assume if you're somebody who's in Pete and John we trust, do you pick and choose which parts you trust and which parts you don't? Or is it just blanket? You trust them or you don't trust them?
Great point. There you go. Put it down. Put it down. No, not for a great question. But, yeah, exactly.
We don't have a great point board.
Yeah. Well, and here's what people would say, though. They'd say, well, Pete's always going to be positive about everybody. So, no, of course, he's not going to say anything wrong.
Yeah.
Did I just answer for the texters?
You might have, but you can hear when he sort of qualifies it. He's never ripping anybody. He is always positive. That's very true. But I think you can see how effusive they are about different guys, and how it's a little more tempered with somebody else. It's just, I think Pete and John have a pretty clear idea on what kind of a football player Jamal Adams is when he's healthy. He's had a terrible stretch of luck when it comes to injuries here. But the idea that he's just not a good football player, I think is widely misguided. I get that you're disappointed in what they paid him and all of that, and he hasn't been available to pay off that contract, so to speak. Totally get that frustration as a fan. But to look at Pete and John on, all these other instances and say, I trust they know exactly what they're doing. I trust Pete and John. But with the one that sticks with you in a negative way and they're telling you the opposite, and you're going, yeah, but they don't know what they're talking about here. He stinks.
That's right. Sometimes they do.
Yeah.
It comes and goes based on my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we talked about that before when last year was Pete's too old. The game's passed him by.
Right.
John's, he can't draft. He hasn't had a good draft since 2012. We were hearing all that. Then all of a sudden, Geno Smith looks ridiculously good. Russell has a brutal season. They win the trade, and all of a sudden, of course, Pete and John knew. They knew the whole time. And Pete and John we trust. So, yeah, it just depends on, if they're in line with your opinion. But here's Pete talking about not having Jamal and what that did to the defense.
Well, again, really, the last 2 years, it did affect us, because we had a real plan how we wanted to utilize him, and he's a terrific ball player, and he would be a big factor, and that's the design of the scheme was all set up with that in mind. So, but I'm not blaming anything on that. That's just we'll take advantage of him when we have him again, and he'll make the most of it.
I was just looking up Minkah Fitzpatrick's numbers, and I think people might compare him, Jamal, to Minkah Fitzpatrick, who has 5 touchdowns now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and he's got 19 interceptions in his 5 years. So I mean, that's just not the kind of player that Jamal Adams is. By the way, he has 0 sacks. So I mean, Jamal's just a different kind of player.
Doesn't have a single sack.
Not Minkah Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, and that's not a knock on him. For some reason I thought he did. Yeah, but it's all about the system they're in and what they're being asked to do.
Right, exactly. He's only got 6 tackles for loss, for example. So, maybe on a short yardage or something, he's coming up near the line of scrimmage. But Jamal Adams is a line of scrimmage type of safety. He's that type of player. He's more like a linebacker. And so, like Pete said, of course you have huge plans. And in case you weren't listening earlier, talked about how when we're out at camp, we're right by where the D-line practices in the front 7. And they had him out there a lot, working on stunts and, blitzes and, things like that, where he was going to be a huge part of being a box player. And, yeah, I mean, that guy would just be – he's so much fun to watch, and he's so fast, and he's ferocious. And, I'd never see him get overwhelmed by a blocker. If it's a big guy, he'll just use his quickness and speed to get around him. But, for the most part, he can take on anybody blocking-wise. So, yeah, it's a total shame. And I don't know, that if you chalk him being injured up to a bust, if that's a bust player, okay. But to me, that means that you thought he was a really good player, and he's not. The Seahawks thought he was a really good player, and he was.